what we're saying is from the beginning, our deepest understanding of contemplation and spiritual direction is about a just, righteous, sacred understanding of myself, of my neighbor, and of God's presence in the earth.
We have a Trinitarian God that is at the very heart communion and community. And so it's in the design. I mean, if we're going to do anything that encounters God, it's always going to take us back outside of ourselves into the world.
I have to be able to think of spiritual direction in terms of a God who is so great and so abundant that he wants to work through all of us to establish the kingdom of God on the earth, to make those things that are wrong right.
And the relationship between justice and contemplation. So what I care about, what's valuable in the relationship, is that contemplation is the source of what is really wise action. So much of justice, the social justice movement, movement is the word for a reason. There's the tension, there's the antagonistic sense of it can almost happen. The issues are important to people. So there's this constant flow of movement in the justice community. And if that movement isn't first and foremost grounded in contemplation, then it becomes the movement of, it lacks creativity, right? It becomes rooted into very narrow-minded problem solving when it's really not looking at the full breadth and scope of what is possible. Because justice is rooted in God's vision of justice. And God's vision of justice is a justice that surprises us, that flips us upside down, right? It turns us on our ear. Because as God's vision for the world is so far beyond what our own vision is. And contemplation then is that place that we take that deep pause and we engage in God's vision. The more we sink into our interior landscape, where we find the source of God's spark and God's creativity, God's call, God's caress. And the more we experience that, then the more we take that back out into the role of justice. So for me, I guess to answer the question, the value, it's invaluable, and I would make the case that real justice work doesn't happen without it. And so to say, what is the relationship between the two of these two is like to say we're putting something together that is new and unique, and it's not. And so in some ways it's reclaiming a relationship that maybe has been long forgotten, but the two of them have always been married in a sense of communion. And so what's invaluable is really remembering that. What's invaluable is reclaiming it, because at the heart of that then, again, is the wise action. And wise action, first and foremost, is an action of contemplation before it ever manifests into putting its fingerprint or its thumbprint out into the world.
And that is incredible relief to me in my own faith, to have grown to a point where I understand that I can't just sit in silence without also thinking about the suffering of the people of color around me, about those people that are not getting a fair wage, those that don't have access to good education or health care. And to know that when I pray and I quiet myself, I am not escaping the injustices of the world, but I am co-creating with God a sacred vessel that is then more responsive to God's voice and then more powerfully able to love and intervene and engage the suffering that's around me. What do you say to people that would argue that justice work, that even it could be idolatrous, that it could be me performing, trying to earn God's approval?
I think I would also offer for your consideration that so is contemplation. Right? When contemplation, when contemplation is the end goal to itself, right, it also then runs the risk of becoming navel-gazing. And so deep, authentic contemplation forces and compels you out into the world. Now, let me say this. So justice, when it's the sole work, right, then we can become hard-hearted. It can become idolatry in that way if that's all we're focusing on, if we're not taking it back into the source of all life, and that we encounter through contemplation. I would make the case it flows the other way too. If we're always internal and just inside ourselves, then we're wasting a precious gift, right? It's like bearing our talent, right, and not using it out into the world, and that's not how that's designed. So,
are just about finished with our second year of the School of Prayer, where in this iteration we've made much more explicit connection between contemplation and justice. So we're reading classical texts on the inner life and on prayer, but also specifically paying attention to Black authors, theologians, spiritual practitioners, and bringing them together. And quite honestly, I'm still learning how these things come together. And what's been exciting about the School of Prayer is having a community to continue to rehearse these questions, both personally, both in my understanding of God, and then in my sense of the really insane things that are happening in our country right now. I had no faith that very many people would be interested in the School of Prayer in this last year, when I was adding this vocabulary of justice in with contemplation. But to my delight and surprise, the Spirit was already stirring in people a desire to do this work. And so we've had 32 folks in 3 different cohorts that during the pandemic and everything, all the layers of suffering, my discernment is that they didn't know how not to do something more. They didn't know how not to be more intentional about their prayer and their understanding of justice. And so really, the School of Contemplative Listening is naturally growing out of the goodness of this community that's forming in and through the invitation.